The provost was very kind in talking about some of our work there, but new diseases emerge from these places. And it's not because of these people's fault. It's because of the condition in which they're forced to live lead to opportunistic pathogens. You have people who are already sick. You have people who have poor nutrition. You have environmental conditions, and I'll talk about that in a second, which allow for these new pathogens to emerge. They will not emerge in a hospital in Boston or in London. So it's not true or accurate to say that there are no new questions left. Those pathogens might impact people in Boston or in London or in Poland, but we need to understand the dynamics of those diseases as they emerge. And of course, trauma and mental health, unique situations that arise and stay with them for a lifetime. How do we sort of think about it? Imaging the brain and trying to understand cognitive ability, the development of young children, and these things. What it does, this idea that there's nothing new left to discover, leads to a problem that it reinforces the ideas, which we do not know whether they work or not, because they were developed a long time ago in different contexts, trying to apply what you learn in Boston and try to apply them in places which are very different from Boston or London, and continue to apply them because new discoveries are not being made. And you've made the assumption that everything has already been discovered. Then there's the other issue that comes from other aspects of research, and that is that there are few funding opportunities. This statement in and of itself is true, but only partly true. When I was a student some time ago, global health was not an area where people would go into. Scientists and engineers thought that was a public health, applied public health area. That's what you did when you went to Africa or sort of collected data. But it was scientists and engineers who made that argument and said that, look, there are new discoveries that need to be made. We need vaccines that would work in those places. We need new technologies that can work in those environments. And that allowed the creation of funding opportunities. It's people like me who are not doing their job very well in making that case that there is limited funding. You have to make that case of basic science and new technologies. STEM disciplines historically have been driven by a very siloed approach, right? You have a control experiment, you do things in the lab, and then you apply. The world is changing. We need new approaches to really change the way we think, to embrace that complexity, to be able to see things that are at the interface of science and technology, but society as well, of conflicts, of climate change. And that requires a very different approach, which requires perception, awareness, and education of current and future students. And that's why a place like Boston University allows you to do that, to take these issues in the classroom and have a debate on these kinds of things. I'll talk about that as well. But these are the three main bottlenecks in which people are not really engaging as often and as frequently and as clearly as they ought to, and I'll talk about these three. So that takes me to some of the work in our lab. And you know, I say this with absolute clarity and honesty, that it is the students who deserve the credit. And I take the credit, they deserve it. But it's their creativity and passion that really sort of keeps me going and really allows us to think deeply about issues. One, they come from a different generation than I do, a generation that I must admit is far more socially conscious than my generation was in many ways. They also come from a generation that cares deeply about issues, historical issues that we have not addressed, that need to be addressed. They imagine a world that is different, and I'm glad for that. Of course, these are all grad students, additional undergrads I've never had an issue with undergrads. I wish I had more space and more hours in my day. My departmental staff has been absolutely phenomenal. You know, nothing would get done if it wasn't for them. Nothing. I mean, I can't order a pen, not because I just can't. And of course, people who have taken a chance on us over the years. So let me go back to this picture. In the last decade, I've had the opportunity to meet incredible people in camps, women and men who've lost everything but would insist that I break bread with them. They wouldn't let me go because that's not okay, right? I mean, if I've come to their place, a place that doesn't look like home, I mean, how can I go? I was in the camp at the border between Syria and Lebanon, and I was with a student. The student was vegan. And the person in the room said, look, I have these apricot cookies and there's no milk in there and you can't go. So I've met these incredible people over the years. But what makes a difference is that you have to build a relationship of trust. If you really want to do something, it takes time, it takes human dignity, and not treating people as if they are under a microscope, treating them as humans. I remember the conversation, my Arabic is awful, but whatever little Arabic I had, having a conversation with somebody about the tomato patch at their home. And my wife, she's the gardener in home. I am sort of the destroyer of gardeners. But we talked about sort of growing tomatoes and what's the best weather. And it was just a wonderful conversation. And it's important to build trust and not go with a chip on your shoulder. Oftentimes, I'm the one who comes out more learned, more educated, and far richer than them. And one way to think about building trust is ensuring that what people get is of the desired quality. So one of our major themes in research is improving the quality of medicines and ensuring that people who get care get quality care, the same quality you and I would expect, the same quality that you and I should demand and would demand. But unfortunately, what ends up happening in many of these places of conflict, or in general sort of economic collapses, is that places that would store medicines would often get destroyed or would get affected. That means that it becomes very easy for people to smuggle in poor quality medicines. It becomes very easy for counterfeit things to come in. It also happens that, well, storage disappears and things that should be stored in cool temperatures are no longer in cool temperatures. Things that should be in a cold chain are no longer there. And we see this problem in a variety of dimensions. We see things, as you see on the top left, poor manufacturing. We see things that, I took that picture in 2014. It had already expired in October of 2013, and this was headed to the health service center. So it was already 6 months late before it was even reaching there. We also see intentional falsification that you see on the bottom left, where the consumer doesn't know which one is real and which one is not. And you also see sort of lack of regulatory oversight, where things are available in the market and people take all kinds of medicines and it sort of leads to complications. And we've been thinking about this problem for quite some time. And certainly is a problem not just in refugee camps, but elsewhere as well. This is really a challenge globally. Of course, refugees and vulnerable groups are at higher risk, but so are other people who are coming from low-income settings in socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. And of course, poor quality medicines lead to antimicrobial resistance in many ways, and that affects all of us. So even if we didn't care, which we should, about sort of the equity, it is something that affects every single one of us. This is a shop in northern Uganda, very close to the South Sudanese border, where we were right before COVID, and there was absolutely no, and this was a pharmaceutical shop, there was absolutely no storage, things were available, there was no capacity to tell which one was real, which one was not. And this is a common problem that you see in many parts of the world. The current technologies that are out there, whether they are recommended by the WHO or are otherwise available, are not suited for these kinds of situations. So either they are bulky. Now WHO calls it 200 pounds and portable. I don't know what that means. But they think that it's portable. But that's they're entitled to their opinion. Or they're very expensive and would not give the right answer. So out of that came our work for technology development, what we call PharmaCheck. And the mission of this technology is to improve access to quality medicines or good quality medicines at all points in the supply chain, no matter where you are, what you look like, what your faith is, what's your sexual orientation, how much you earn. You should get quality medicines. That is a basic fundamental human right. If you are paying for it, if somebody else is paying for it, you should not get a substandard medicine. That is just not acceptable. Specifically, we are very interested in trying to understand where these problems are. Are these in the rainy season? Are these closer to the sites of conflict? Are these farther from there? Do they sort of spike up as rainy season starts or as a conflict starts. We're also very interested in really developing or co-developing technology with our partners on the ground in low and middle income countries, so that there is a sense of ownership, that they are part of this process in problem solving. And we learn a lot from that. Certainly, we're very interested in policy development. I know there are people here who have a lot of experience in policy as well. And finally, the long-term goal is to really address that fundamental mission that we started with, that people, no matter where they are, get quality medicines. And that's important for their health. That's important for protecting the financial investments that are made by their countries, by international agencies, by donors, by supporters. So multiple iterations of this, but now the final prototype that we have that is sort of reaching its final stages of implementation and going to be used in both East and West Africa, as well as Indonesia and hopefully in Pakistan as well, is something that's the size of, I would say, a laptop and weighs about 10 pounds, so better than 200. The technology underneath that is actually quite straightforward. So the user doesn't have to do anything. They can take a tablet, a TB drug, or an antibiotic, they put it in. We have come up with molecules, specific molecules that would bind to that drug. They give off a signal, and that you can tell how much is in there, right? So if the signal is calibrated to 60%, then it tells you that it's 60% pure, 90%, and we have a whole spectrum of drugs. Initially, when I started this, the chip that we had was the size of a postage stamp, and my kid said, "What's a postage stamp?" But we've sort of changed it now. Now it's the size of a Band-Aid, and they know what a Band-Aid is. And it's a simplified user experience, right? So it's fully integrated. It has a sort of a touch screen, and so there's a TB cartridge, and there's a malaria cartridge, and there's an antibiotic cartridge. And also we are careful about waste management as well. We can do all of the antimalarials. And the reason to choose antimalarials is that in many parts of the world, malaria continues to be the single biggest killer. Malaria drugs are often the ones that are substandard and counterfeit, and malaria drugs are often not given in these boxes, but are often given in paper bags by the hospital. So it's very hard really to track things. At some point, you have to test what's in the pill. You cannot just look at the box and say it's a good box or not. And that's something that we've been sort of really thinking about. We can also do something which is called dissolution measurement. So anytime any of you take a tablet, or I take a tablet, there is something that is called dissolution. It doesn't release all of its active ingredient in a nanosecond. It does it over a period of time. It could be 30 minutes, it could be 2 hours, but it can't be 5 days. It's not like a marble pellet sitting in your stomach. And there are drugs that may have the right active ingredient, but wouldn't have the right dissolution. So they would release it too fast, causing toxicity, or they wouldn't release it, so the people would sort of get worse and worse and worse. So we can really do that at the point of care as well. And that's something that is certainly important in terms of overall performance. We've tested a variety of different drugs, and Minilab is what the WHO uses. HPLC is the gold standard, and we are within 30%. We are within 3% of that, and our cost would be a few $100. HPLC is about $150,000. So we're certainly, and we're not saying that we're replacing all technology. We're sort of empowering local communities so that they can sort of do this triage of sorts, right? They can see at the customs point when you get large shipments, whether some of these are pure or impure. They can sort of make better decisions in that regard. So this is sort of some pictures of our colleagues and working in different parts of the world. And also, one of the things that we are very keen on is to empower local communities. So this is our friend Alfred, works in Ghana, and both of his kids had malaria. And for him to have the sense that there are instruments available that can test the quality of medicines that his kids would get is tremendously important for us, right? It is not something that we just want to sort of push on the market, particularly in low-income market, but develop a sense of co-ownership, develop a sense of sort of co-creation in many ways as well. We want to create a new field standard, results that are relevant and contextual, and certainly significant lower costs. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that we improve the system as a whole as well, not individuals alone, but system as a whole. We want the entire system, not just Alfred, but other people like Alfred, people well beyond the network of Alfred who benefit from that as well. So we are working with medicine regulatory authorities in several countries, along with UNHCR, in improving the quality of medicines that people get. And to be able to say that, look, there's a problem here. And not only is this an ethical and a moral problem, this is also a problem that in the long term is going to affect all of us. So that was the first thing that my lab and I have been working on. Another one is the environment that we are in, and the environment that many refugees, whether they are in a camp or in an urban environment, have to see. This is one of the larger slums in Karachi, in Pakistan, in southern city of Pakistan. And the people who live here are stateless communities. So in 1971, when Pakistan split into two, East Pakistan became Bangladesh, West Pakistan became modern day Pakistan, they were ethnically Bengali people who were citizens, but their citizenship was stripped away because they were considered enemies or enemy sympathizers or enemy supporters. 50 years later, they're still stateless. They live in these kind of communities. Right? Even their kids who are born, who are technically entitled to birthright citizenship, remain stateless. These are pictures, real pictures of the environment that they live in. Now imagine you're poor, you're denied all rights, and you have to live in a place like this. Right? And then that creates a sense of xenophobia that, oh, these people are always sick anyway. So these are poor people, they are sick, right? So you create a certain perception as well. So how do we sort of think about that? And this is just one example of sort of this issue. Another example relevant to the current crisis are pictures from places like Ukraine. Places which are forests, which are much more pristine and green places. Many of them look like this now. It will take a generation for these places to change. Imagine people who have to come back and live in these places, in these surroundings. And we know that the conflict and weapons of war already create challenges for long-term diseases. We've seen that in the Second Gulf War in Iraq with the emergence of something that was called Iraqi Bacter. We're seeing this in Afghanistan, and there's absolutely every reason to assume that things like these will emerge in Ukraine as well. And you know who they affect? I have met kids in Beirut who were born well after the US operations ended, and they're getting sick now. It stays in the environment. And how do we think about how does disease start and how does disease emerge? So one of the things that we are doing is really thinking about environmental surveillance and seeing how diseases start. So there are several ways of that, and unfortunately in the post-COVID world, you would probably hear sort of wastewater surveillance. You hear that often, right? Boston's water has a spike in COVID, viral load or other things as well. But we were sort of doing that certainly before that. But the idea is that to take all of that and not just do surveillance, but also do modeling so that we can predict what might be happening in the next 3 or 6 months so people can do something about it, right? It is not just the fact that we want to be able to say that, oh, next week something is going to be terrible or everybody should start wearing masks. You don't have that luxury. But what you do have in places like universities is the ability to work with data scientists and mathematical modelers and scientists and epidemiologists to be able to create models, simple models, and then test and validate them. Places like the ones that I showed in Machar Colony in Karachi, to be able to say there is a likelihood of infection that will affect so many communities, not just that community, but beyond as well. What can we do? What is most efficient? And we can certainly see sort of how antibiotic resistance would develop, whether you have specific mutations that could be tested, whether you have specific antibiotics that shouldn't be used, and things of that nature. You also have challenges associated with lead poisoning in many of these places, whether you are in the southern port of Greece or in Ukraine or in other parts of conflict. And I think it's important to recognize the refugee camp or a refugee environment, and we're working with both ecologists and modelers here to imagine it as an ecosystem. It is not just a combination of people. It is also the place that changes, and people change that place. New people come, some people leave. New people come with new sort of disease dynamics. New people come with sort of different age groups and different sort of profile. As new people come, the environment changes. And oftentimes that environment already is very, very toxic and poisonous. So how do we sort of think about those kinds of things and imagine this in a way? Historically, just as research has been siloed, our imagination of these places has been siloed. You're a TB person, you're a water person, you're a nutrition person, but really breaking those silos, because people are not can be put in neat, clean bins and boxes. You really have to change that paradigm as well. And again, we're sort of looking at interactions of people with environment and how antimicrobial resistance develops. One of the things that we are excited about is to be able to demonstrate how just mere presence of zinc in the environment makes people susceptible to antimicrobial resistance against a leading antibiotic called ciprofloxacin. And this is some of the work that a student in my lab, Mark, has demonstrated, that weapons of war, and increasingly as weapons become more and more sophisticated, they have heavy metals and they have cadmium and they have zinc, and that goes into the environment. Environment already has these bacteria, right? And they interact, and they sort of lead to development of new pathogens that are not going to respond to your antibiotics. So we can sort of simulate these things as well. So the next part, and there are many other sort of things that I would love to talk about, but in the interest of time, so we talked about sort of the basic discovery of how the environment plays a role. We talked about improving the quality of medicines, but there is another part as well. How do you get medicines to the right place in these kinds of complex environments, right? Imagine Pakistan. Nobody knew at the beginning of August what kind of floods the country would have. There was some forecasting, but not to the extent that it ended up happening. How do you prepare yourself at a short notice? How do you put things in the right place and sort of have the right logistics? And here I turn your attention to, we're living in a world where crises are coming one after the other, and it's often easy to forget the previous one because a new one is dominating the news. But I want to take your attention to one that continues, and that is in Yemen. At the beginning of 2018 and 2019, it was called the worst humanitarian crisis the world has seen in a century. That hasn't changed. What has changed is something has become worse. That sort of tragedy continues to unfold. It is something else that has taken up the news cycles. You'd be hard-pressed to find anything in Afghanistan today. It's not to say that the problem hasn't been resolved there. The famine continues, the diseases continue, the deprivation continues, women still cannot go to school. All of those things are happening, but the attention moves somewhere else. There will be a day when there will be a new story, but that is not right. As academics, as researchers, we really need to think about these problems at a systems level and not sort of just ignore the previous one just because there is a new one. We have to look at the new one, but we also have to continue with the previous one as well. That's why it's important to really think about it at the systems level. And this is a story from Irish Times. I don't know if I can show Irish Times here or not, but anyway, from 2017. And so one of the things that we've been working with is UNICEF. So UNICEF is very interested in making sure that you are prepared, right? As these crises hit, so there's a short-term impact of that. Of course, there's loss of life and death, but then there's a long-term crisis of malnutrition that sort of really unfolds with young children over a period of a long time. And sometimes it stays forever, right? So there's the immediacy of conflict, and that's what is concerning in Ukraine as well. And there's a longer term issue, and that hits the most vulnerable, both in terms of socioeconomics and in terms of age, pregnant women, young children. So one of the things that we are interested in working with UNICEF, and we've sort of, and I'll show you in a second, thing that led to change in policy there, is to be able to understand how do people sort of move from these states. And again, it seems almost inhuman to say that they're states, but just imagine that how do people get sick and how do you prepare for that sickness? And they become they're sick and then they're sicker and then they're sicker, and some of them then pass away and some of them get better. And what is that transition? Trying to understand how you prepare for that. When somebody is acutely sick and needs to be hospitalized, what are the resources that are needed? When somebody can be treated at home or at a sort of a primary care clinic, what are the resources that are needed? When somebody is healthy, how do you keep them healthy? Right? And what are the resources needed for all of them? So some of the work that we are doing is in that regard. And I want to show this work in particular. So this is the work done by an undergraduate, Rana Hussain, just an absolutely brilliant undergrad. And what she was troubled by was that UNICEF was using a model about malnutrition in Yemen that was developed in the 1980s in Congo. Right? So you're looking at completely different times, completely different contexts, completely different nature of the conflict. And the fact is that you are using that to model all of the things. And on the right-hand side, you see sort of there are two things basically here. And this is in one directorate looking at SAM, which is severe acute malnourishment, and MAM, which is moderate acute malnourishment. Light blue is what the adjusted values are based on the model, and dark blue is what the original model values, original values are what they're using. And the reason it all started was that the UNICEF staff telling us that what we are seeing is far worse than what the models are predicting. Right? So they were using these models from the 1980s from a different location. They said the model says we should have this much incidence, but it's way more. What's going on? So it was a question that had to be asked. I mean, if UNICEF's entire logistics is based on a model from the 1980s and it is massively undershooting, then there are people who are not getting care. So this was taken up by an undergraduate in the lab, and now this is the new policy of UNICEF in Yemen, of updating it. The reason I tell this story is, one, because we have absolutely amazing undergraduates, not just graduate students and postdocs and faculty. The undergraduates are absolutely amazing. And two, when you give them a problem that really makes a difference, it brings out in them things that, I mean, my contribution in this entire thing, and I kid you not, was to get out of her way. That's what I did, right? And she led the way. She would sort of wake up at odd times to have a conversation and all of those things. But that really tells you that if you tell them these right questions that really bring out the best in them, they can really make a change. And that takes me to what we are doing at BU as a community, as an institution. Historically, when you're looking at issues of forced displacement or refugee studies or migration studies, there are two places where that happens. Either it happens in international relations and political science and sociology, or it happens in public health. And there's no reason that there should be any silos. As we have seen, there are problems in health, there are problems in technology. There are also problems in social sciences. So one doesn't need to exclude them, but really need to think. So I'm grateful and honored for the support that Provost Morrison has provided to start a center on forced displacement. It's a university-wide center, bringing colleagues, students, scholars, postdocs, visitors from all parts of campus, from philosophy and ethics to science and engineering, from public health to sociology. And there isn't a single place on this planet where this happens. The largest refugee study center is at Oxford, not far from here, but that is much more focused on social sciences. There are others, there's one in Johns Hopkins, focused exclusively on public health. But to really span this, because you really want to think about this at the systems level, and not, I mean, there are questions about refugee history that allow us to understand what is happening today, but there are also questions about how do you clean wastewater? And really need to bring this together. So the mission is to support new ideas, technologies, scholarship, awareness, and new solution identification that will improve the human condition of vulnerable persons who are forced to leave their homes, not just because of conflict, but because of persecution. Right? We know this, that people can be of a certain faith or certain sexual orientation, and they're forced out of their homes because they're undesirable by the state as it imagines them, or the state sort of makes them stateless. And the center supports research and engagement with forced displacement and humanitarian emergency that is truly interdisciplinary. And there are 4 themes of that, and I want you to sort of think about those 4 themes. They're human environments and climates. That means both climate change, but also the place that you live in, art, expression, and identities, because we need to understand who these people are as people. They also have art and rich poetry and scholarship and expression that deserves just as much attention as anybody else. Healthy lives and meaningful livelihoods, right? So we want to make sure their health is there, but employment is very much on the minds of people. And of course, the final part is, how do we train the next generation, right? I mean, if we are going to make the next generations ethical leaders, what should they learn? What should they reflect on? What is missing here, and by design, is that this is not an area study center. It's not an Africa center. It's not a South Asia center, because these problems cut across the world. And that's what we really want to focus. This is not an engineering center. This is not a center that is focused on social sciences alone. So what is different than this? If you type or sort of search for centers on migration or center of forced displacement, there are many centers that will come up. But this is really different, and I mean it. First, it goes beyond individual disciplines and individual geographies. We really want to pay attention to people as people. Of course, somebody says that my expertise is in Colombia, that's great. But this is not a Colombia center. That person might also benefit from working with somebody else who has worked in another place and has sort of seen that, and bring sort of that connection as well. Beyond area studies, and we want leadership in science and technology and social sciences and the arts. And by leadership here, I mean both ethical leadership of students, but also leadership in terms of new ideas. The platform is global, and it's global in many senses. It is in person, and we'll have visiting scholars and scientists. I was just telling somebody that we will have artists in residence and scholars and postdoc and researchers in residence, but it is also global in its many different sort of angles. We have sort of book talks and research talks, online and in person. And we also want to make sure that we understand the context, but at least really push ourselves in the vision that is bold and transformative, not sort of incremental things, right? And this is where I think the university has tremendous power, because it can look at the research and academic work, but also think about how do you really take that into account and create sustainable and meaningful change. I'll give an example. This is one of the programs that we have developed, bringing sort of students and scholarship on that. And the idea is to expose students in many different ways, engage them, and really sort of think about giving them experience that is meaningful and ethically appropriate. So exposure to grandest challenges of our time, antimicrobial resistance and urban poverty and safer environments, things that I talked about. We talk about these things in the classroom, but we also help them work with their colleagues in other countries who are at the forefront of these crises. Right? We don't want to go and be a volunteerist and get pictures taken in a camp. What we want to do is want to work with universities. For example, American University of Beirut, where students are seeing things in their vicinity. Makerere University in Uganda, University of Los Andes in Colombia. And this peer-to-peer learning is absolutely important. My kids and our students learn tremendously from their peers, from thinking about it, from having an open environment for the exchange of these ideas. And it is now possible because of support from the Provost's office in terms of travel, but also in terms of Zoom and other opportunities as well. And then you really need to engage with rigor and beyond disciplinary boundaries. The fact that polio is coming back in Ukraine is not just a problem of public health. It has to do with politics as well. It has to do with basic science of how the polio virus survives. It also has to do with the fact that how is healthcare delivered? It also has to do with the fact where the funding for this comes from. So if you really want to look at the problem and you look at it in isolation, you might understand some of the science, but you will not be in a position to really address it in ways that are rich. So these are some of the programs that we are working on and we have worked over the years. And we've been very fortunate that some of these programs have already gotten the attention. For example, when we were in Uganda, the program of engaging of BU with Makerere students was so exciting that we were invited by the Prime Minister in his office to really talk about this and sort of really to integrate that in the curriculum and sort of continue with that relationship. Our students learned tremendously, and so did Makerere students. Our students have continued to really amaze us in terms of and again, these are many of them are undergraduates winning sort of major prizes with sort of simple solutions, but are rooted in both context and ethics and working with local communities. Certainly, there is an element of the arts here as well, to be able to do storytelling, to be able to humanize this. That is just as important as coming up with new solutions. We have to tell people that we care and we mean it. So I want to end with sort of, I promised the provost that I'll end before 8, and it's one of the rare moments when I'm keeping my promise. So I'm very proud of myself right now. So what are some of the next set of challenges that we are thinking about? We need to create tools that are fit for discovery and research and analysis and impact. We cannot use the same thing from 1980s Congo and apply them to Yemen. We cannot use things that have never been tested in the field and call it state of the art and destroy the lives and make impacts on things. We have to create tools. And here I mean not just tools as in gadgets, but sort of intellectual tools, economic tools, financial tools in thinking about that. We have to pay attention to urban environments as well. Most refugees do not live in camps anymore. They are integrated into the lowest rung of urban poverty and are often forgotten. They're invisible. There are people in London, there are people in Rome and Paris, and there are people in Pakistan. And increasingly, there is a nexus of environment, climate change and conflict that leads to migration. And we have to really think about how do we really sort of look at the confluence of these factors, and how do we sort of really study that across disciplines. I took this picture. This is northern Uganda, very close to the South Sudanese border. And this is a health facility. And if you look at the picture, it is not a welcoming place. It actually tells, keep out. Right? So there's barbed wire, and instead of a health facility that says, if you're ill, come over and we'll do something. This says, no, you're not welcome here. If you're ill, well, you're poor and we don't like you and don't come here. And I was really troubled by sort of the environment. And I came back, this is right before the pandemic, and I thought of why it troubled me. And I was reading something and I came across somebody who used to be at Boston University, and it really sort of stuck with me. And his name was Elie Wiesel. And he said that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And I believe that we've been indifferent for far too long, that we just don't care. And my hope is that through our research and the center and other things, we'll be able to overcome that indifference, to really make an impact, because it is an investment in our own lives and in our own future. So thank you very much.
If people have questions remotely, they can submit them as well. Questions?
How do I get in here?
Yeah, I'll start off.
So one of the most impressive things that you talk about here is the device that you've invented. Can you share with everybody the importance of not just identifying and patenting that and getting the protocols done, but actually commercializing it, and the partnership, I'm assuming, with either NGOs or industry, or supporting some of those students that actually want to start companies? And I actually know of a couple that are working in the refugee space from BU that are entrepreneurs, and that brings everything full circle. So if you can address the commercialization and the partnerships with industry.
So thank you so much. So there have been several partners at different stages, because the technology, again, I didn't go into the detail, has several interesting parts. One is sort of the guts of the technology as the molecules that we develop, and that is of interest to a number of companies that are interested in improving their own supply chains. For example, I'll give names here. GSK, the local company here in UK, sort of a big name, they're very interested in improving their own manufacturing. So they want to sort of use this not at the end point, but sort of improving their own system. So we've had partnership with them. Right now, we're working with Merck, the German Merck, not the US Merck, and they're very interested in sort of working across Africa and improving that. The financing of that is actually quite interesting. So there are two different models. One model is that you work with countries and sort of the local things, but increasingly we're seeing that in many of these emerging economies, there is a demand for high quality healthcare in the private or the semi-private sector, right? So there are large hospitals or hospital chains or pharmacies that are interested in saying, look, get this from us because we guarantee quality, right? In a place where quality is often elusive. So in Southeast Asia, in Philippines, we are working with sort of a pharmacy chain, not a pharmaceutical company, but a pharmacy chain that is interested in putting it in their system and saying we are sort of stamping it with that. So it's been a wonderful experience sort of working across the corporate social responsibility arm, but also the financial arm of these companies, and really learning. I mean, I'll be honest, we did not know how many of these things work in the real world, right? The ability to pay, who pays, how does it get attributed, how do you divide that up, and sort of looking at short-term models, long-term models, and thinking about health systems. So it's been a wonderful experience. We've benefited tremendously from working with students in the business school, in engineering, in public health, but also students who have an appreciation for local context. So it's been a wonderful, I mean, of course, in one slide, things look great, but it's an 8-year journey of heartaches and heartbreaks. But we are proud to have been at this point. Kari, I think there's some questions.
Yes, I think I was told I was next up on this. That was an extraordinary talk, and I want to commend the work of your center for what it is doing. This runs to the core of what a research university ought to be about, in my judgment. My question concerns, again, some of the technological advances that you mentioned earlier. And to what extent are these actually being employed in the field in any of these places? That's the first part of the question. And secondly, are you working with any nonprofit organizations? I can think of a couple that we're active with who would benefit from working with you. So that's my question, really.
Answer the second one. We're always eager to learn, Bill, from our nonprofit partners, because they often have a laser focus on doing certain things that we may or may not appreciate. So we have worked with, as I mentioned, UNICEF, sort of large international organization, UNHCR. Through the center, we are sort of looking at, again, partnerships with these organizations, but I would love to hear from you, the groups that you have in mind. I mean, this is an issue for those of you who are from Boston, Martha's Vineyard. It is not just so one part of a program that I didn't talk about focuses on the U.S. southern border and the challenges of the communities there. So we would love to hear from you on that.
Yeah.
Technological part, 2 answers. The first one is that, as I said, the mathematical modeling and the tools that we developed there are being used. As I mentioned, they are now part of the Yemen policy. We are now sort of extending the same program to Afghanistan and also to South Sudan, so that if I define technology broadly as sort of both sort of hardware and software, the software part is, the hardware part is now in a stage where we want to do some kind of pilot. We've done mini pilots, which have been very, very good. But you know, this also is important to recognize that many parts of the world have tremendous complexity in getting approvals. And some of those are right and important. Some of those are bureaucratic. But we hope that both in northern Uganda and in Rwanda, we'll hopefully within next year, we'll have our technology using sort of testing at least antibiotics and antimalarials.
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Kati, is Kati in the room? Please give Professor Zaman my phone number. Yes. I'm serious.
Yes. Consider it done.
Shapari?
I suppose you've already answered part of my question, which was, we all know that nothing really happens at certain levels without government institutions becoming involved. So as Boston University, you know, you've ticked so many of the boxes and gone through the trouble of bringing, you know, this wonderful concept product to this level. How do you think you could collaborate with governmental institutions, and what kind of platforms as Boston University, you know, could you foresee, or would you sort of work with?
That's a really good question, and not an easy one to answer. All of you have a lot more experience than I do. What I've learned is that in government, what matters is who you know and contacts. That's a tremendously important thing to open the first door, right? If I were to just call the State Department and said, look, you guys are doing this, why don't we talk? Nothing is going to happen. And in places where we have made the impact, it's largely our personal connections because you also have to remember that they are getting people who are far smarter than I am with tens of ideas. So which one do they choose, right? I mean, they're inundated with these ideas and sort of solutions. So a lot of it has to do with that personal contact in places like Rwanda and Uganda, Pakistan again, as well as in Ghana. It has largely been our personal contacts that have sort of really opened up the door. And then we believe that we can then sort of say that, look, this is a need, this is how you think about it, and this is how you do it. So to answer your Very important question. There is no formula, except for the fact that you have to sort of really go through it in each country and understand and respect their systems and allow for that to incubate. That said, there is a bit of a domino effect that once you demonstrate, so for example, if you do it in country X, they'll say, have you done it elsewhere? And once you have done that, then it's a lot easier to do that in another country. And I think it's sort of what one might call a nucleation effect, right? You form a bubble and there's a bigger bubble and there's a bigger bubble and so on and so forth. So I think they're at the point where at least we've had the first couple of bubbles and people are taking notice of that. Certainly with our work with UNICEF, once we did the thing in Yemen, there was the idea, oh, can you do the same in South Sudan? Right now, we're also seeing a pretty devastating crisis in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region as well. So then it starts to build what I would call, when I said in the beginning that you have to build trust with people who are vulnerable, you have to build trust with everybody that you are going to deliver. And I think that's where we are, and we've been very fortunate, and I'll be absolutely honest that the university has been tremendously supportive in that regard.
Do we track the number of cases that there is around the world, let's say starting in 1900, and as A numbers and a percentage of the world population? And the second part of it is, why is it that it's not only Boston University, but the world doesn't focus on it if we are at a crisis level? And why does it take a back seat to climate change or to the energy issues, when in essence this is probably more of a problem, as you've described it, than we really want to admit to ourselves?
I think the answer to your second question is buried in your question that I think we just don't like to admit. I'm not a psychologist to really comment on that, but I think there's a lot of I mean, we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and confront ourselves with that. There's a lot of things that we have done as individuals, through our apathy, through our lack of empathy, that leads to this, right? I mean, I tell anybody that come with us and spend some time with these people, and they're just like you and me, perhaps far richer in their perspective, with a big heart, and it just, I used to work on something else, and once I got involved in this, there's no going back, because this has given me meaning in ways that is just extraordinary. And too often we don't choose to be uncomfortable and confront. I think my family was tremendously xenophobic when I was growing up in Pakistan. They still are to a certain extent. I think I was a product of that as well. It took me a long time to figure out that no, not everything that is wrong in Pakistan is because of Afghan refugees. But that's what I grew up with. And if you tell that to people in Pakistan, they'll be like, no, you're absolutely wrong. So it takes time, perhaps an event, to confront this. I think this is a problem that requires us to come out of our proverbial comfort zone and say, look, this is not how decent human beings should act, regardless of where we are, regardless of our ability. I mean, I'm very, very passionate about this because I've seen it with my own eyes of the deprivation that exists in these places. And that is just not, I mean, no human should live in those places and in those conditions. And there's no agency, right? So I'll give another example of Pakistan. The Bengali population that I talked about, and I'm not Bengali, and I come from a privileged background in Pakistan, not necessarily financially privileged, but as a male, you're privileged enough in Pakistan. And I am from the majority sect, I'm from Punjab, all of that. Nobody ever told me things happening with Bengalis. And they didn't even get COVID vaccines. Nobody was giving it to them because they didn't have an ID card. And if you don't have an ID card, you don't exist. And if you don't exist, why should we give you any vaccines? It was much later that they realized that if we don't give them vaccines, they're going to get sick and we're going to get sick, that they said, oh, let's start giving them vaccines, right? So I think, Stuart, what you're saying is absolutely right. But I hope, and I genuinely believe this, and the provost knows this very well, that the reason I do this work at Boston University is because I think we have a unique platform to really build and raise the voice and elevate that to a point where people will start taking notice. My family, my neighbors, people here, your neighbors, and I think that change can happen. You have to be an optimist to be able to work in these places, otherwise it's very easy to sort of say this is too hard. And I think a lot of people just say it's too hard and I just don't want to deal with it.
The second part of my question, are the number of refugees now greater than they were 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago, or is it a constant problem?
So they are greater now than they were 20 years ago. However, you asked a very good question. I don't use the word unprecedented, because in Second World War in China alone, 100 million people were, when the Japanese moved in, 100 million people were displaced. So I don't use the word unprecedented, but if you, starting the early 90s, the number tracking has changed. Because before 1990s, internally displaced people were not counted. So in 1992, 93, that number has constantly increased. And the reason is that people are not going back, right? That's part of the challenge. So the displacement is protracted. And that's why also we need to think about this differently, because when somebody is displaced in the short term, their needs might be about water and food and nutrition. But somebody, when they're displaced for 75 years, the Palestinians, when somebody is displaced for 20-something years in Kakuma in Kenya, when somebody is displaced 40 years, Afghans in Pakistan, you cannot vaccinate them every day. You have to think about it differently. There's education involved, there's housing involved, there's trauma and mental health. And for far too long, our focus has been as if this is a humanitarian emergency, not a protracted crisis. There's a very different way of thinking about the two. One. And the second thing is you also have to recognize that most people go into neighboring countries which themselves are poor. And that creates another additional level of xenophobia, that why are these people who we don't like anyway getting German medicines whereas I'm getting made in India medicines, right? Those kinds of things. So you have to think about this as a development challenge, not as a humanitarian emergency. And that's also important. And again, those are the kinds of things that students at BU and elsewhere have started to think about. And I think, I wouldn't say that things are changing because many of these are political problems, but I think a general sense that this cannot go on. This is immoral, this is vulgar, this is unethical, this is unbecoming of who we are as people.
I have a question.
Please.
Do you think that the explicit inclusion of science and technology and emphasis on the opportunity for greater understanding of fundamental scientific questions by engaging in this array of issues has the capacity to accelerate? Shapari asked about government interaction. Do you think those aspects have any chance of accelerating the interest in government?
Absolutely. So I think there are two reasons for that. One is I think there are many, so we would all love for the problems, many of them have a political origin, to disappear. That would be great, but that is not happening, and that is often much more complicated. But the people who are displaced, their health and well-being requires science and technology tools. Clean water, vaccination, access to healthcare, improved housing. That is not just a sociology or an anthropology or a political science problem. So that's one. Second reason is that many of our students in science are absolutely brilliant. It's not to say that humanities ones are not, but they bring a different perspective of systems thinking, I tell people that, I mean, people think of engineering as people who make gadgets, but at the core of sending somebody to the moon was also engineering, trying to imagine this as a system. At the core of Amazon and delivery is engineering as well, right? It's not that they have a monopoly in all the solutions, but they need to have a seat at that table, right? So that's something to think about. And the third one is I think many governments, and this is a question that Shapari asked earlier, are less interested in the theoretical foundation and much more interested in practical solutions. And if you're thinking of practical solutions, you have to engage science and technology, certainly with tremendous ethics, but you have to engage them. So I think there is, again, thanks to your support and the support of the university, there's an opportunity to do something both different and bold, but also do things in a way that may have an appetite, that may create an appetite to engage in generating those ways. And then including the historical understanding and anthropology and ethics and all of that. But I think that my science and engineering students, I come from a department that is just an outstanding department. I'm just absolutely honored and privileged to be part of that. Those students are just absolutely amazing. You give them the problem and they will come up with solutions that not only you haven't thought about, you'll never think about because they're just very smart.
Great. I think there's one question on, we'll do the last question.
Actually, it's more a comment from a parent in Istanbul. Zeynep is saying, absolutely amazing. A holistic approach to displacement as a civic volunteer who works with refugees in Istanbul. I'm so happy to see that someone does this. And so glad that my son is attending BU. So I wanted to
Well, I hope he'll get in touch with me.
Yes.
All right. So please join me in thanking Mohammed for a wonderful lecture. And I'd also like to close by thanking once again Bill and Patty and Aaron Kleh for their generous and wonderful support of the Kleh Lecture Series. Bill and Patty and Aaron, we miss you guys, and we hope you're well. So thank you, everybody, for coming.